Mark Kenny, the latest Fairfax Ipsos poll reveals that Tony Abbott is starting to trail behind Bill Shorten as preferred Prime Minister. Has the Liberal leadership again become a live issue?
I think it has become a live issue, at least to the extent that people are starting to talk about it. There is a bit of chatter at low levels around the party and probably between ministers about what the government is going to do, because the big danger for the party that they can all see now, for the government that they can all see now, is that not only is the government trailing Labor by 8 points on the latest poll and on previous polls, it seems to be an entrenched deficit that the government is now suffering with. So talk has inevitably gone to, well, what are we going to do to turn this around? And there don't seem to be too many options.
We've seen a lot of manoeuvring on the issue of same-sex marriage. There's the issue itself, but others are looking at it through the prism of leadership and how different possible contenders are positioning themselves on that issue. So let's go through those. First of all, Scott Morrison, how has he positioned himself on that issue?
Well, Scott Morrison is opposed to marriage reform, to changing the Marriage Act to bring about same-sex marriage equality, and he's become a champion of this idea of a referendum. And that, of course, would be a constitutional referendum to actually change the definition of marriage in the Constitution. Now, that's already attracted a very comprehensive and efficient slapdown from the Attorney General, George Brandis. Brandis is in favour of marriage reform, and he's pointed out that there's absolutely no justification for a referendum. There's no need to change the mention of marriage in the Constitution, because all it does at section 5121 is list that as one of the topics that the Federal Parliament has the power to legislate on. So the idea of a referendum is just folly, and seen by the proponents of change to be the blocking tactic that it obviously is.
So, but it's Scott Morrison, it's not really to do with his portfolio, he's advanced that. Is that got some sort of shades of leadership positioning to it?
Well, I think when you get to this stage of a government, a year out from an election, trailing so badly, a very, very unpopular Prime Minister, and the possibilities that there may be some sort of change, then pretty well everything that these leading people do, it has to be seen through that prism. So yes, his position is one that will be popular to the right of the party. There's a sort of a sense that, look, we have to give some ground here, we have to look like we're consulting the people, so let's go for a referendum. Of course, we know that a referendum, apart from being unnecessary, would be just about impossible to win for the proponents of change. You have to have a majority of votes in a majority of states to bring it about, and of course it would be a very heated issue, and it would be highly unlikely when it did happen, and that would be some way down the track, which is one of the other attractive reasons for proposing it, that when, you'd have to be, it'd be a fairly heroic assumption to think that you could actually win it. And so Morrison's speaking to the right of the party and giving them this option.
Now, Julie Bishop is another person who's mentioned as a potential leader. That marathon 6-hour party room meeting, she didn't make her position clear. What's going on there? Is that again to be seen through the prism of leadership?
I think so. Obviously with Tony Abbott travelling so badly, the alternative that most often gets talked about is Malcolm Turnbull. Turnbull's very pro marriage equality, pro change. Julie Bishop is considered to be a moderate, and most people would expect that she would take the same view. So it was quite interesting that in that marathon party room meeting, she did not express a personal position. Rather, she supported this idea of putting it to the people. Now, she's not advocating the same thing as Morrison, i.e. a referendum, but she is advocating that it be that the government have a policy of proposing to put this to the people in a plebiscite, so in a non-binding vote at some point. Now, that the timing of that's a subject of some discussion, but she and Hockey and a few others are in favour of that. So I think that tells you a little bit about the way Julie Bishop is treading very carefully here. If there is to be a leadership change, whoever gets the numbers against Tony Abbott, if that's the case, needs to bring the right along with them, needs to bring the Conservative wing of the party. I think Julie Bishop's position reflects the fact that she would like to get those votes behind her, and she knows they're not going to line up behind Turnbull, not unless they've got very little choice, and she's probably providing them with that choice.
Yes, I mean, the Fairfax Ipsos poll shows that Malcolm Turnbull is very much the preferred alternative leader, at least when it comes to voters across the board. But this issue of same-sex marriage, it's kind of like the wrong issue at the wrong time for Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, yes and no. What the poll shows is that support for marriage equality remains very strong and stable at 69% in this poll and in the previous poll we did. So that's consistent with a lot of other polling as well that shows that support for that is very strong. So Turnbull's on the right side of that, as he is on the right side of a number of other issues in terms of popular support.
But what about in the party room?
Yeah, that's right. It doesn't make him necessarily popular with Conservatives, and particularly within the party room. So even when you look at that same question, who's more popular as Liberal leader, and you exclude all other voters and just look at coalition voters, you find that Tony Abbott is still ahead of Malcolm Turnbull.
So every time Malcolm Turnbull comes out and says, I'm in favour of same-sex marriage, but hey, I'm going to be bound by, I'm going to do the right thing by the party, I'm going to be bound by cabinet solidarity, that grates on the Conservatives. It
grates on the Conservatives, and there are Conservatives in the Liberal Party who say they will never cop Malcolm Turnbull back in the leadership after he was knocked off in 2009. And remember, that was by one vote when Tony Abbott replaced him. It was a very narrow thing, but the party was very divided under his leadership toward the end there, and that's why Abbott was able to knock him off. But yeah, that's right. When you see Malcolm Turnbull adopting these positions, many people on the Conservative side of the party are saying, well, this is Turnbull, he's too moderate, he's too progressive, he's not really one of us.
Finally, on leadership itself and any timing, we saw the spill back in February. The polls remain bad for the government and Tony Abbott. How long can this continue, or can it continue all the way to the election?
Well, it's a very good question. We saw that in 2007. It was a pretty different situation, mind you. We had a Prime Minister in John Howard who'd been around. He was in his 12th year, effectively, as Prime Minister. And all the polls said that voters were swinging behind Kevin Rudd at the time. There was talk about replacing John Howard with Peter Costello. In the end, the party didn't do anything. They just sort of dolefully filed over the cliff with John Howard, and pretty well all of them knew for a long time before that election result that they were going to lose. Would that happen again? Well, you would say not, and you would particularly say so on the basis of what Labor did to Kevin Rudd and what a disaster it was for Labor knocking off a sitting Prime Minister. But another way of looking at it is that, as this poll shows and other polls have shown, Malcolm Turnbull is a lot more popular with voters across the board, and this government has lost the middle ground in Australian politics. It's polarised itself, it's retreated to the right. Tony Abbott appears to be talking to the right of his party. A lot of his positions appear agreeable to them, but not to Middle Australia. So it's possible that Liberal MPs will just take the view that, look, as much as we might have reservations about Malcolm Turnbull, we're going to switch to him because we can win with him and we can't win with Tony Abbott. And that's the problem with this entrenched, deficit in polling that the government has at the moment. People are starting to say, what can we do to turn this around? We don't have any money in the budget and we don't have any political capital. So what are we going to do? There might only be one answer, and that's change leader.
Mark Kenny, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Chris.